Every person of color in this country has faced an indignity, from the ridiculous to the grotesque to the sometimes fatal, at some point in their, I'm going to say last couple of hours, because of their skin color. Quick story. So we live in New York City, a liberal bastion. Recently, let me finish. Recently, we sent a correspondent and a producer to a building in this liberal bastion where we were going to tape an interview. The producer, white, dressed in what could only be described as homeless elf attire, and a pretty strong 5 o'clock from the previous week's shadow, strode confidently into the building, preceding our
certain. Michael Brown was killed on August 9th. There was some kind of altercation at the police car. Apparently Brown was shot as he was fleeing. He turned around, and then we don't know what happened. Some witnesses say he had his hands up and did nothing else. Some witnesses say he had his hands up and he stumbled forward because he was injured. And some witnesses said he actually moved towards Officer Wilson aggressively. We don't know really what that happened there. All we know is that there was some altercation, and then from there all things went wrong. What I'm talking about, though, is how those events are perceived, because the reality of whites and blacks in America is very different, and that affects how they perceive these very seemingly innocuous, seemingly, you know, this is what happened, but how we see those events are very different, depends on what our perceptions are. So we're going to talk about what are our perceptions, why there's so much mistrust among police, how that affects the view on whether or not justice was served, and how, if possible, we can change these perceptions. So a whole bunch of studies here. If you look at it, they're all saying the same thing. These surveys show that black people and white people have very different perceptions of what happened. Was Brown targeted because of his race? If you're white, you say yes. If you're black, I'm sorry, if you're white, you say no. If you're black, you say yes. Was the killing justified? If you're white, you say yes. If you're black, you say no. Should Officer Wilson be prosecuted? Should be charged with a crime? Again, if you're white, you say no. If you're black, you say yes. Very different attitudes, very different perceptions. And why? Why is there so much more mistrust of police? Well, it's a long history of it. I'm hoping we'll hear, you know, I'm sure we'll hear more on that. But I'm going to give you some data points. Again, I'm throwing this on the web if you want more. But Missouri has a really cool program where they track every police stop in the state, both at the city level, at the county level, and at the statewide level. And if you look at the level, you break it down any way you want. Whites are more likely to have contraband in their cars, but blacks are more likely to be stopped, and blacks are more likely to be searched. So the contraband hit rate for whites in 2013 was 26% for whites and 18.8% for blacks. So again, whites are more likely to have drugs in their cars, even though blacks are stopped and searched more often. And this is not a fluke. Here's the table showing the statewide data. You can go back, and what's cool, Missouri's been doing this for 13 years now. You can go back to any other year and you see the same data. 2010, 2005, 2002. It's the same statistic. Year after year after year, blacks and Hispanics too, get pulled over more often, get searched more often, yet every year the results are the same. Whites are more likely to have drugs or guns or contraband in their cars. And there's also, you can break it down by Ferguson, by city as well, and you can look at it. It's the Attorney General website. It's a really useful website. But profiling is not limited to just Missouri. Missouri just does a really good job of keeping track of all that. In New York City, they used to have something called stop and frisk, and guess who was stopped and frisked? Overwhelmingly black, 52%, and 31% Hispanic. Yet again, if you were white, you were much more likely to have drugs or contraband on your possession, even though blacks and Hispanics were far more likely to be searched. Police shootings. Most people who are killed by police are black and Latinos. Chicago, Illinois, 91% of people shot by police and killed by police are black, even though the percentage is only 33%. So again, all the way through, you see the statistics over and over and over again. In Walmart, a week before the Michael Brown shooting, this gentleman went to Walmart, picked up a BB gun, and started talking to his girlfriend on the phone, and you can see him swinging this, just playing, he's just swinging the gun around. Somebody calls the police and says there's a dangerous black man in the store with a gun, he's threatening people, and the police, you just saw the police just killed him. Right there. That was the police just killed this guy in Ohio, a week before Michael Brown was killed. There was a grand jury. A grand jury, there's actually one going on in St. Louis. A grand jury is a jury that's, it's kind of like a regular jury, except their job is not to find innocence or guilt, but to see is there enough evidence for a trial. And the grand jury, in this case, ruled there was not evidence to indict, to accuse the officer of wrongdoing. And so another black man was shot down, this time on videotape. So white and black realities are different. They're very different. And I want to stress this, I'm not blaming cops, because I think being a police officer has got to be one of the toughest, it probably is the toughest job. It is a hard job. I wouldn't want to do it. It's far too dangerous for me. I'm a wuss. I wouldn't want to do that. But it is, you know, the reality is there. I don't understand why blacks are pulled over. I try to think good of everybody, but something's wrong, and something is weird in our society. But this is year after year after year, state after state after state. This is not just a local Ferguson thing. And my argument is, unless we understand why, we won't really get a full grasp of what's going on. And so this reality of mistrust, this reality of being pulled over, of being shot at, this creates, and being harassed, this creates mistrust, not just of police, but of society in general. And so even though there are reasonable, for example, why did it take so long for the county police to get to the scene? There's actually a reasonable reason for that. There's a very good reason for that, because there was a robbery down south in St. Anthony's Medical Center earlier that morning. So again, there are reasons for these things. But if you have a very heightened mistrust, you're going to be a lot more angry than you would if you didn't have this built-up mistrust. And even Ferguson Police Chief Jackson did apologize for the 4-hour wait. He thought that was too long. But I've looked at other data that shows that 4 hours is not totally, it's crazy that's that long, but it's not uncommon to wait that long. But this mistrust feeds this. And this perception shapes reality. So how the government, how the police are viewed affects whether they think there's going to be justice out of the system. The grand jury is meeting right now. They just pushed it back until January. There's a grand jury going on, going to decide whether or not Officer Wilson should be indicted. My guess is that if they wouldn't indict the officers when they have on video of shooting that guy in Walmart, they're not going to indict Officer Wilson. Obviously, a different grand jury, different people, but you have to have some evidence. And right now, unfortunately, because Michael Brown was shot and killed, one less witness to testify to a contrary statement. So there's always a problem there. But my fear is that and it's the reality, these polarized perceptions will lead to radically polarized conclusions. And if you don't believe that what's happening in this grand jury and Prosecutor McCullough, if you don't believe that this is a fair process, you're not going to be happy. I'm not sure, even if he was indicted, I don't think he would be convicted because there's so many conflicting testimonies about what actually happened in that shooting. But, not having that, I think, is going to raise real concerns because of this pattern of mistrust. So what do? Well, my argument is that we should continue to track, what Missouri does is really good. We should track these police stops, but we also need to act on them. Police, we've been stopping people, overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic, for 13 years now, but nothing has changed. It's the same data year after year after year. Installing cameras, which they are doing, I think is really good. If there were other witnesses, there's a really brief, I think I'm almost out of time, there's a really brief video which happened a couple weeks after Michael Brown. You can turn the volume up if you can.
So
is that it? Okay.
I think this is silent.
No. This is there should be some volume. I'm not sure why it's not working, but that's okay. This is a Black man in a gas station, pulling the gas station. The police officer asked him to get his license. He reached out to try to get his license. The police officer shot him, and he was not killed. He was wounded. He was not killed. But in this case, because they had the camera, he was pulled over because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And so because he didn't have, the cop had a camera in the car, they were actually able to see what actually happened. And this police officer was actually indicted, and he is going on trial for assault. So cameras can really do wonders. So I'm out of time. So I do want to turn over to, I think we said Grace Moser next.
I'm going to set a timer for myself. For those of you who don't know, historians are notorious for going over time. So just to let you know, I have 8 pages, and I have 10 minutes. But I just wanted to make one quick thing for my students who are in my 101 class. You're supposed to be taking notes right now, so hopefully you got that message. Okay. Man, this whole experience has been incredibly difficult for me. I live in Ferguson. I grew up in Ferguson, I grew up in North County, I still live there today. I bought a house in Ferguson because I wanted to live in a racially diverse area. And I have to be honest with you, I was really nervous about doing this presentation today just because it's been such a stressful situation. So I'm going to do my best to provide a context, because one of the things that I keep hearing over and over again is that this isn't about race. No, it's a cop doing his job. You know, there's no racial motivation in there, we should not consider race. And all I have to say is, you're absolutely naive if you think this is not about race. There's a strong history of racism in St. Louis and in Ferguson, and I'm going to provide some of the context for that. So I want to read you a newspaper article, all right? And then I'm going to ask you a couple questions about it afterwards. It says, for an hour and a half last evening, I saw the massacre of helpless Negroes at Broadway and 4th Street in downtown East St. Louis, where a black skin was a death warrant. I saw man after man with his hands raised, pleading for his life, surrounded by groups of men who knew nothing about him except that he was black, and saw them administer the historic sentence of intolerance, death by stoning. I saw Negro women begging for mercy, set upon by a white woman, who laughed and answered the coarse sallies of the men as they beat the Negress' faces and breasts with stones and sticks. It was not my idea of a mob. The East St. Louis affair, as I saw it, was a manhunt. There was no crowd of hot-headed youths. Younger men were in greater number, but they were middle-aged, no less active in destroying every discoverable black man. Get the N-word was the slogan, and it was varied by the recurrent cry of get another. So when I read that to you, it's a weird newspaper report. I was struck when I read it with how similar it sounds to the newspaper reports I've heard discussing the Mike Brown affair. But this article was written by a white reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1917, 100 years earlier than the Mike Brown affair. I was particularly struck with the line that says, I saw man after man with his hands raised pleading for his life, and still the death sentence was administered. Different circumstances. This newspaper article is describing a race riot that happened in East St. Louis in 1917, but it demonstrates very clearly a long, well-documented history of racial discrimination in St. Louis and Ferguson, and I'm going to provide more of that context. So there are so many similarities between that, and one of the things that I've been struck with the most in living in Ferguson, I think the thing that's been most disturbing to me, is how much the words that I hear people say sound like 1917, 1968, words that I thought were erased from American memory as just a dirty memory being thrown around casually by people on Facebook, on Twitter. I don't know if you guys saw the video of the protesters at the Cardinals game. That is bad. That's racism. And racism has been an undercurrent. And a lot of times I find that my students have a hard problem with this concept because they think, well, racism was resolved. The civil rights movement made racism illegal. It took away the discrimination in the law. Here's the problem. Racism is a system. It's systemic. It's everywhere. It's not an individual action. We've seen some individual actions, but in the history of St. Louis, it has become a part of our culture, it has become a part of our life, and discrimination happens on a daily basis if the color of your skin is not white. Okay, throw that in, I sound serious. I am serious. All right, brief history, and I'm already at half through my time, so I'm gonna be really fast. St. Louis was founded by slaveholders. We've had slavery since the foundation of 1764 St. Louis. We're in the 250th anniversary, first under the French, then under the Spanish. When the Americans acquired St. Louis in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, some people thought that they would actually abolish slavery because that's what they did with the Northwest Territory. They did not. They protected it. Slavery was protected within the Constitution. 1858 in St. Louis, Dred Scott decision established that black men are not citizens and that they have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. It's written into St. Louis history, it's written into our national history. But the time period in St. Louis that has the biggest relevance, I think, for us as a city and for understanding the whole metropolitan area, which, by the way, it's not just St. Louis, it's not just Ferguson. When people look at this area, the metropolitan area of St. Louis includes St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Franklin County, Jefferson County, St. Charles County, St. Clair County in Illinois, and Monroe County were all looked at as the same area. So I want to show you guys this map right here. This was published by Where We Stand, which is an organization that compares us to other cities all over the country. And this is a racially segregated map. St. Louis is the 6th most segregated city. And when we're talking about St. Louis, we're not just talking about downtown St. Louis, we're talking about this metropolitan area, including St. Charles County. The blue dots are white people. The green dots are everyone else. And Ferguson, do I have a little laser? Ferguson's right here in this green area, blue area. We are a primarily black city, but we haven't always been that way. The way that it got started was because of a decision in 1876. It was a separation of the city and county. It seemed innocuous at the time. It had to do with country residents, which were the wealthy St. Louisans, dictating taxes for everybody in the city, so they decided to make a separation, which you can see in this map. That black line that surrounds there, that's what's considered the city. Everything outside of that is county, right? So they made the decision to separate, but this is arguably one of the most important factors in creating segregation and racial discrimination in St. Louis. It goes back to 1876, right? So there's a long history of discrimination. We have the 1917 race riots. Those were caused by black Americans competing with white German immigrants for jobs, right? And there's long discrimination of black Americans being discriminated against. Here's the thing, guys. Black men and women were regularly paid less than white men and women. So it's economic discrimination as well, right? Just to put throw some numbers out there. The average median household income in St. Charles County, which by the way is primarily white, if we go back and look at this map, right? The average median income here is around $70,000. The average median income in Ferguson, which is 70% black currently, is $36,000. So we're talking about serious economic impacts, systemic racism, systemic discrimination that has long-term effects beyond just ordinary, everyday intermixings and dealings with the police. It also affects your ability to be economically successful because of that discrimination. So St. Louis discussed residential segregation in the 19-teens, right? And ultimately that law passed, but it was overturned by the federal government as being illegal. St. Louisans found a way around it with restrictive covenants, which is basically when you bought your house, you made an agreement not to sell it to black people. So even in Ferguson today, there are black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods, right? Here's Ferguson in 1970. We can sort of trace this shift because of this separation of city and county and something that's called white flight. The economic base, the strong economic base of the city moves out to the county. So this is Ferguson in 1970. And the light blue is lower percentages of African Americans than the dark blue is 80% or more. So Ferguson is in that red, that's 1970, right? Here's 1990, and you can see that white area is moving further out in the county here. This is 2010. And in Ferguson here, you can see these darker blue areas and these lighter blue areas. There are white parts of Ferguson and black parts of Ferguson. So even within Ferguson, we are really segregated, right? And this is a serious problem. And this is where a lot of those racial tensions are coming from. I'm still running out of time. So what happened with Ferguson? Why this white flight, right? Ferguson was the fastest growing city from around a suburb of St. Louis from around 1930 until 1960, right? This is where most of the middle class white people were moving from the city. And when they did that, they took their tax base, they took their schools, they took everything with them. So that can help explain some of the poverty in the inner city today, right? But in the 1970s, the manufacturing jobs that were based in Ferguson closed. So this included a Chevy plant, which moved to Kentucky. Right, that plant closed in 1987. It's not a coincidence that the 90s are a time of white flight. Guess where that plant, a new plant opened up by GM? Does anybody know where? Wentzville, around the same time. So it makes sense that you would see a pattern of migration out to this area in pursuit of the jobs. But there are long-term effects of that, and we have lots of evidence of racism that is associated with that. So Ferguson is now an economically depressed area, and there's other factors. The apartment complex where Mike Brown was killed, Camden Trace, I think is what it's called. Canfield, sorry. I live there, you would think I know that. Ironically, it is also one of the black areas, which even as a white resident of Ferguson, I'm noticing that in my own experience, I've been restricted to certain areas, and this isn't on a conscious decision on my part. And now I'm making a conscious decision to go into those areas and talk to those people and get to know them. But that apartment complex, a lot of the residents moved in there with St. Louis airport expansions in the 80s and 90s. So Lambert Airport basically destroyed 75% of Kinloch, which was a black city, and pushed those people into Ferguson. And what happens again is black people, because they've been discriminated against economically, are bringing in lower incomes. And that's driving the total wealth of Ferguson down, and it also leads to resentment. But one thing I would caution you, it's not because black people are inferior. It's because they've been racially discriminated against from getting those higher income jobs, from being in schools that don't have access to the same levels of education, right? So this is the context of Ferguson today. 1990, 25% black. 2010, 70% black. It is a very real, traceable shift and pattern that's happened, and it's associated with all levels of segregation and discrimination. And I think I'm going to have another discussion at some point in the future, because I've definitely gone over. So, next person.
I don't have PowerPoints. Not that that's bad. I have my timer as well. If you're taking notes, the two words you're going to write down are implicit attitude. Those are the two words for my 10-minute presentation, implicit attitude. I am 30-something years of age, and I am actually very upset at this moment. I'm very upset at this particular moment because of the events that happened on that Saturday. And the most interesting thing about the events that happened on that Saturday is that when I heard that an unarmed black teenager was killed by a white police officer, in my particular community and the individuals that I talked to, our first response was, that makes sense. It wasn't, what did that black teenager do? It wasn't, oh my gosh, he must have robbed somebody. It was, that makes sense. Some of the conflict that we're dealing with between blacks and whites is because we're coming at it from two different perspectives or angles based on the implicit attitudes that we might have. Is this whistling or is that me? I was raised by a mother, and her mother's a very excellent person. My particular mother said that you should excel and achieve at everything that you do, and no matter how much you should achieve and excel, just be aware of one particular fact, and that one particular fact is that people are going to say things about you because your skin is black. And I didn't mean to rhyme right there, that's just how it came out. But when she said that to me, she wasn't saying, oh, because you're black, you're supposed to be strong. Because you're black, know what happened in Africa. She was saying, because you're black, people are going to associate you with several different things. One is going to be criminality. They're going to say that you're a criminal. Second, they're going to say you're going to have this authority problem, you're going to be disrespectful. And third, when you're in school and they talk about slavery, they're going to look right at you because obviously because you're black, you know more about it. They want to know what your opinion is. My opinion, like yours, is that slavery is a horrible thing, but I myself am not a slave. The events that happened on Saturday didn't surprise those in that particular area because they were taught the exact same thing. That even though they're struggling and striving to make things work, regardless, people are going to see them as criminals who have absolutely no respect for the things that are going on around them. They're going to be lazy. They're just raised by single moms whose only job is to push out more babies and keep their hands out to get more things, because that's what's taught, that's what's put out in the media. It is not that we're saying that an individual who's black is a victim. It's a simple fact that it's a reality that you have to live within. So when I heard what happened on Saturday, I said, wow, that makes sense. And the individuals in that particular community were outraged, as they should be, because they saw one of their own gunned down in the streets. And your very first response is, wait a minute, let due process work. Don't jump to conclusions. There you go again, they're just being too emotional. That's what they're going to do. It does make sense to be emotional when an individual that you feel is a part of a community that you see as a brother, as you feel, you just gunned down recklessly for no particular reason. So they waited, just like I waited for Sunday when no information was going to come out. And that new information was going to help quell the uprising that was happening. And you know what that new information said? That new information said the perspective that individual is going to take is simply this. Mike Brown caused his own death because he did a strong arm robbery an hour and a half before. And everyone knows that when you do a robbery, death should happen next. What the individuals in the community heard was the exact same thing I heard. It was a blaming the victim, and therefore, those are the consequences. I'm going to make a comparison real fast that might hurt others. I'm not trying to. If I had a daughter who was raped by a man, I know she was raped, and I asked the police for information. And your first response was, you know, she slept with 2 guys the night before, but we're pretty sure she was raped, maybe. How mad would that make you? Because you're basically saying that my daughter deserved what happened to her. And that's how it felt on that Sunday, that you basically said that he robbed, and therefore death is what happened. The second thing that information did is it rewrote the narrative. It said that, hey, it makes sense that the officer stopped him and that maybe Mike Brown reached into the car because we know he's a violent criminal because we have a videotape of it. It wasn't a situation where the African-American community was sitting there like, let's go riot, let's go loot. We were saying, give us information that makes sense. And your response to that particular information, referring to the police, was to blame the individual for the act. It's the criminal act that occurred. So people started to get mad, so they started to protest and stand on the streets. And if you've never been in that particular area, I'm going to assume you've never been in that particular area, where the protest initially happened is a very narrow 2-way lane. An individual was standing on both sides of that very narrow 2-way lane, and they said, we don't want to take this, we don't want to handle this. The police came driving through with truck after truck, trying to go through and break up this protest, and the protesters stood there and said, we're not going to move, hands up, don't shoot us. And they stood in the street and they said, hands up, don't shoot us, because they're telling you we are tired and fed up, number one, of being called a criminal every time that you see us and saying that we have an authority problem. So the police brought the dogs out, which is a form of crowd control. And the response was, you don't see what I'm saying, you don't understand what I'm saying. And I'm not even telling you as an African American that my perspective or view is right or wrong. I'm simply telling you that my particular view is an alternative view of how to look at things. See, your particular view is that obviously Officer Wilson is right because he's the police and they don't do wrong. And my particular view, based on my particular experiences, I don't know who's right or wrong, but it's a possibility that Officer Wilson could have been wrong. And you reject my particular view because of what we call an implicit attitude. An implicit attitude is simply the acceptance of an idea that I don't even have a conscious thought about. I'm going to give you a quick example. If you go to your class and you sit next to a person named Bertha, she's sitting there with you. In your mind right now, the first image that you see is not a small, blonde-haired, petite individual. It's not. It's either someone very large or who looks very, very old. Because that's what Bertha suggests to you. It's the same way that when you walk around a particular campus and you have to ask notes from a particular student you've never seen before, you can ask either Jim or you can ask Shawana. Who will you ask? Jim or Shawana? And it's not because you are inherently racist. It's because we accept ideas because we don't know other information. Implicit attitudes does not say, you are racist walking around. It says individuals put things out there and we tend to accept. And that is the recurring problem. My esteemed colleague brought out some amazing statistics, and I appreciate them because they're accurate. And they're not saying that we are all individuals who are trying to hurt other people. We just accept basic ideas. Our view of America is amazing, but a lot of times our view is constricted by the individual that we see in the mirror, and we label that person the American. So that when you see someone who looks a little bit different than you, you have an automatic assumption of what that person knows or has been through. You see someone who's a little different than you, and you say to yourself, wow, I wonder how long they've been here. Wow, you look a little different from my particular area. Can I ask you a question? And your response, of course, is what is that question they ask you? What's it like to be like a paid-for bride? Because you look like you're from another country. I know they do that over there. You ask that particular question because someone looks different than you. You ask me a question, because I mentioned slavery, which is interesting, because you assume I have a belief that's different than yours, and I might have a belief that's inherently worse than yours, but it's a horrible situation. And someone says, how do you fix implicit attitudes? It's becoming aware that you have them. Police are more likely to shoot at a black criminal who's armed than a white one. That's implicit attitude. They're not walking around, shoot black people. They just associate black with criminality. Teachers in the school district teach black students different than teachers that are in white school districts. It's not because teachers are saying black is worse. They lower the expectation because they think because you're black, you might not know everything. So if you give an answer that's low quality, I accept it because I know you're trying. Doctors are less likely to prescribe treatment for black patients simply because they're black individuals. They're not saying, I want black people to die, but the idea is that because you're black, you're less likely to follow the treatment, and that leads to my behavior changing. When I watch television, and the biggest thing on television now is ISIS, 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 and that actually starts to prime you, so that if someone says that they're Muslim, your first idea is, oh man, you must be cutting off the heads of people. It's not because you're a racist person, it's because you're accepting an implicit idea or attitude. The best and fastest way to fix that is be aware that you actually have it. You can't ever sit and reject the idea that I have accepted what the media says. When I watch television, I watch a lot of television, I watch it like my son watches it, and I'm running over. And I watch it like my son watches it, and I don't see anybody that looks like him. Sorry. My son is, he wants to date someone. He's 17. And the reason I know that there are implicit attitudes is that he went out with this girl, and she was like, well, that's neither here nor there. He said, Dad, I like her. I said, she's all right. He said, Dad, I really like her. And I said to him, do the parents know that you're black? He's like, I haven't told them yet. I said, be careful. So he went out with her, and he liked it. He's like, I love her. I love Isabella. That's her name. I love her. The father met him for the first time, and the next day she said she couldn't be with him. That's all I have.
Has living in Ferguson, and I don't have the experience that Marvin has being an African-American man in America. All I can give you is an educational perspective from a sociological background, because that's what I do. So I happen to be teaching sociology over the summer at Maryville University. I have 2 jobs, full-time here, part-time there. I need money. And I was coming to the last class of the semester, and our chapters were collective behavior, acting crowds, social movements, and the event took place over the weekend. the shooting of Michael Brown, and then my class met that week. And some of my students at Maryville were students who live in Ferguson or in the North County area. So there was this desire to talk. They wanted to talk about it, and I saw it as, again, the teachable moment, capturing this moment in time where we can understand not necessarily the race relations, but we can understand the crowd. What happened with the crowd, and why did it get to where it got to? And we're still there. It's not over. The other interesting thing that was happening at the same time, and both of these events, the shooting in Ferguson, but also the ice bucket challenge, were just everywhere. And it was such an interesting dynamic. We're watching human suffering, we're watching racism, pain, suffering, and we're watching people dump buckets of ice water on their head to raise money for a cause. And so my students were very conflicted, as was I. How can we live in this society where we just constantly are revolving from anger to hope and anger to hope and anger to hope on the same day, the same Twitter feed? So it was very interesting, and I allowed my students to choose which example of collective behavior they wanted to write about, Ferguson or the Ice Bucket Challenge. If you want to hear more about the Ice Bucket Challenge, you can ask me later, because that was very interesting. I'm going to talk about Ferguson. So we're talking about collective behavior, which is behavior that it suspends all social norms. You're all following a social norm. You're attending an academic presentation, you're sitting, you're paying attention. Some of you are on your phones because you're not interested, that's all right, we don't hold that against you. But you're following a set of social norms. And we usually do that. In a collective group, in a social crowd, we have norms that govern our behavior, we follow those norms, everything's good. But there are times where the actions of the group will bypass the norms and something new will happen. So if there was a fire alarm that went off, we're going to react, and we're going to act collectively. Now we know the rules of fire alarms: orderly, women and children first, men stay and perish. But there might be some chaos at that time. And so we watched some chaos ensue, and we saw some specific examples of collective behavior occur in Ferguson, and these are fairly predictable collective responses to an action when there are some circumstances that are in place. So we saw rioting, tons of rumors fueled by the media, fueled by individuals, fueled by ignorance and inexperience. We saw some panic and a little bit of mass hysteria, people just kind of freaking out. People who live in Ferguson, people who live around Ferguson, people who are avoiding Ferguson and North County at all costs because they were so panicked. The moral panic gets into our fears that we are going to be perhaps personally assaulted as a result of this. Fads and fashions, that even plays a role in what happened in Ferguson, and eventually one day this will be an urban legend. So we're seeing every aspect of collective behavior in one event. And this is behavior that was noted many, many years ago. So as Grace has pointed out, discrimination and racism has been around forever, and so is collective behavior. It was a British journalist who was watching, nice, ordinary country folk who turned into this angry mob, this stampede. They were like herds, and their attitudes and behaviors just snapped. And they went from being good country folk to being this angry, reacting crowd at various times. So he was the first person to really talk about the herd mentality and how crowds, being in a group, can change you, the individual. So if you're sitting at home watching the news reports on Ferguson, maybe you had a personal response to it. And maybe you called a couple friends who perhaps share your perspectives so that you could commiserate about how you were feeling. But if you were in Ferguson, that crowd behavior can change. It can change your behavior, it can change your psyche, it can change everything. So 50 years later, we have a French psychologist who's talking about how when you're in a crowd, you feel a little bit anonymous. You're blending in. You're not going to stand out. So if one of you's on your phone, we're not going to point you out and say, hey, you on your phone, because there are other people on the phone too, and there are a lot of you here, and do I really care if one person's on the phone? So you feel less accountable for your personal behavior because you're surrounded by people who can hide you and blend in with you. And sometimes you feel invincible, like you can go above and beyond. I'm going to do something big because I'm in a crowd, and the crowd will do it with me. And I tell my sociology students, you don't run naked across campus by yourself. You streak in a group. You all go together, naked butts all the way, so that you don't feel like you're going to stand out. So this collective mind, or what we call groupthink, develops, and it sweeps you up. And you may even do things that you would never consider doing before, because you're swept up in the emotion, the excitement of what's going on. And this can then, like mass hysteria, it becomes hypnotic.
and it takes over this crowd mentality, this crowd behavior. So what happened in Ferguson? It often goes a little bit like this. There's social unrest, and there is a history of social unrest in Ferguson, we know this. It is dated back to the 1800s. It is tense. The tension is there. And then it gets manifested as people are talking about it, especially if you're in or near the area where the unrest has been for so long. And so the shooting takes place, and then what happens is there's this communication. I'm talking to Paul, I'm saying, did you hear? He's like, no, what happened? There was a shooting. Tell me more. And we start talking, and we feed off of each other. And we start fueling it with rumors. Well, I don't really know what happens, but here's what I think I know what happened, and probably we're right. And now Paul's angry too. And we're both like, oh man, we gotta do something. So we talk to Marvin. Marvin, did you hear? Yeah, I heard. How do you feel? And then we start to just circulate this emotion back and forth, and we collectively get this impulse to do something. We gotta do something. But the three of us aren't gonna do it alone. We need people. We need backup, we need a posse, we need a stampede, we need a herd. So if you're in a crowd and you can convince the crowd to feel the same way you feel, you can collectively focus that energy. And so we become an acting crowd. We're an excited group and we're moving toward a goal. And this excited group, it took a little while to develop, but they got there. So it starts with the tension or unrest, then there's an exciting event, that was the shooting. But because we're in the age of media, it took a couple days to kind of get more information and decide, do we need to act or are we good? So there was some action taking place at the time, but it took a couple days to really kind of gain some momentum. So people are milling about, they're standing around, they're talking about the event some more. They're trying to get information, and when you don't have information, you fill the blanks with rumors and speculation. And then people accept that as fact because they don't know any differently, and you seem smart, so you must know what you're talking about. So that continues this excitement. And then there's the common object of attention. What are we gonna do? QT, let's take it down. Let's move toward it. So the energy needs to be expended and the group needs to do something, so they look for somebody or something to focus that energy. And then they have the common impulses. Let's burn it down. Let's break it down. Let's throw stuff. So, and these are common crowd reactions. We see this all over the country and all over the world, and sometimes we just don't even know when it's gonna happen. Because there's a lot of unrest everywhere, and there are a lot of these shootings, as Paul pointed out with his statistics. These take place all the time. Why is it that this one has turned into what it has turned into? Because we were primed and ready. We were 100 years in the making. We've been ready for this event for a long time, and it happened. So acting crowds don't always have to be negative or destructive. Sometimes they do respond peacefully. Maybe it is a candlelight vigil. And those attempts were made in Ferguson. There were groups that said, we want to respond, but we want to respond peacefully. We want to make a point, but we don't want this to draw, the negative attention. But it took another turn as well, and there was rioting, and there was looting, and the media got involved, and so we had a different view. So the emergent norms are the new norms that are established when things are disrupting our normal life, and we have to respond with new norms, new situation. I'm also running out of time, so I'm like, what do I gotta say, what do I don't want to say? So to deal with the new events, we established new norms. Children didn't go to school, and we understood why. Businesses had to shut down, we understand why. Some people had to go stay with relatives, and we understand why, because the old way of living was currently suspended. You didn't get to do what you normally did when you lived in North County for a while. Some people still aren't comfortable going back there. The children's education has suffered as a result because new norms had to emerge. And not everybody in the crowd felt the same way. That has been very clearly identified. So the 5 types of crowd participants, you do have people who are ego involved. They have a personal stake in what's going on. Residents in Ferguson, the family of Michael Brown, police officers, Wilson's family. These are all people who have a clear connection to what's going on. You have the concerned, we're interested, but we're not as involved. Maybe it's because we don't live there. We know people who do live there. We're concerned about our friends, our community, how St. Louis is being portrayed to others. You have the insecure, and we saw those people coming from all over the place. This was just an opportunity to feel powerful. This is the looting. This is what has some of us so upset, is that people who felt powerless now feel powerful, but they're directing that power in a very destructive way. They're ruining the businesses in Ferguson. Why would you do that in your own community? Not everybody was from that community. Some people came in from other communities. A lot of curious spectators, that's the media, and the world. I mean, people around the world are tuned into what's going on, and they don't even know it's Ferguson anymore. They just think it's St. Louis, Missouri, so we've been categorized differently. But people are curious. We want to know, and the media feeds that curiosity. And then you have people who have taken advantage of the situation, who are exploiting the situation. And I just picked one example, and then I'm going to run out of time, but the t-shirt industry. You have t-shirts. You have t-shirts to support the Brown family and their residents of Ferguson, and you have t-shirts to support Wilson and police officers. And so those were t-shirts that were sold to raise money, and I was trying to find additional t-shirts for Wilson, and they were just, "We support Wilson," and it was a shield, a police shield. The one that really, really I find so offensive is the "keep calm and don't shoot." That's exploitation, because it's taking this trite phrase that we use, keep calm, carry on, keep calm, do this, keep calm. It's pop culture. And we're taking a very serious event and turning it into a pop culture item that you can purchase online for $9.99. That's all I have.
Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michael Kuelker, and since it's 10 minutes that I get, let me get to the point. My point is twofold. One, that this represents a new civil rights movement. Two, and interrelated with this, alternative media play a profoundly important role in articulating and even shaping the movement. I had no idea that there would be this many people, and we're going to have some Q&A and observations from you in just a few minutes. So thank you for staying here. Thank you for being here. I had no idea whatsoever that more than 100 people would show. What's being distributed is a 8-page booklet that I made that gives a short overview of this as a civil rights subject. And I encourage you to think about this and frame the subject in terms of civil rights, because that's really what it is. And again, with that, media portrayals are very important. And I'm here to tell you that having been transfixed by Ferguson, not only in the first 10 days, but since then, the role of independent media has been extremely profound. But first of all, what are civil rights? These are the basic rights that we have. And this, the right to life and the right to safety are the rights from which all others flow. And this is not a time to get into too much history, because it is 10 minutes that we get. But we have a number of other rights articulated in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, and we are a country that seeks to have equal rights and justice under the law. Equal rights and justice for everyone. And it's been a long road to get there. And one of the precepts about studying civil rights is that when civil rights achievements are made, it's never via a straight line or a narrow, straight-looking road, if you will. And we can study this in terms of history, and we can look at a historical timeline, but a timeline is not history. A timeline is just that. It's linear. And so, if we look at Ferguson as a civil rights issue, we're going to see a lot of things, from strides forward in the direction of equal rights and justice for everyone under the law. And we're going to see some missteps, some sidesteps, a lot of things. It's going to be messy looking in actual fact. And one of the interesting things about this subject, as a civil rights subject, is suggested to you in the last 2 or 3 pages. Because this has been called a leaderless movement. It is not top-down management, wherein we have a leader like Dr. King, 45 and more years ago, leading the movement. And yes, there are some national figures who've come in, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, and a few others, but they're not the ones leading this movement. One of the most fascinating dimensions of this thing is that we have new and younger leadership who are taking charge and leading the way towards civil rights. And that includes a lot of civil rights demonstrations. It has included looting. That's not actually a civil rights demonstration itself, but that's just one dimension of a much, much larger series of types of response that we've seen. And the new leadership is using and relying upon some of the alternative media. Antonio French has a very active Twitter account. He's an alderman in Ferguson. And if you don't know Antonio French, please look him up, because he's really a hero. And he's one of those people who went out on the front lines trying to talk people down, take your anger and direct it some other kind of way, not through destruction. Antonio French is just one of many people whose Twitter accounts are alive with really essential information. And this handout that I've distributed, I'm sorry that everybody doesn't have one, tries to outline some of the civil rights issues. After the 9th of August, we've seen a lot of response and counter-response by authorities. And among the civil rights issues that we have to deal with as thinking people is what kind of policing do we want in our communities? Because the militarized response that next week after the original incident on August 9th has attracted international attention. We saw tanks, we saw SWAT teams, we saw snipers aiming at unarmed, peaceful protesters. And there was a media dimension to this that was spectacular. It was spectacle. And that's what, especially that first 8 or 10 days did. It aroused all kinds of very deep feeling things in us. And depending on your point of view, what was aroused? Anger, hate, fascination. Maybe we felt energized. It probably covers the entire spectrum of responses. And it is frightening, because among the realities of this situation in the first 10 days were outside agitators. When the subject of exploitation comes up, I would probably point to other examples beyond t-shirts. I think it was exploited for the anarchists to come in and use that opportunity to foment more anarchy, or for the communists party out of Chicago to come down and try to cause more havoc. When we understand things in the language of civil rights, we're not just talking about law and media, we're talking about all kinds of things. That's why I'm glad that this is an interdisciplinary panel, because we do need to know more about sociology, psychology, political science, and especially history. Because what we're seeing is a set of power relations and call and response, if you will. And one of the interesting things for me in terms of observing this and participating in this too is the variety of responses towards civil rights. Because we did see some really bad examples of looting. And I do think we should focus to some extent on looting. I think we can learn from bad behavior. After all, I teach Nazism in my Holocaust class, and I don't teach Nazism like this, but we need to understand that as a phenomenon. But that was just one variety of the black experience and a whole rainbow set of responses. I'm carefully watching the time too. So in addition to the militarized policing, we do need to be aware of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. We're getting down to the essence. When we study civil rights, we're getting down to exactly what type of protest in the street is allowable under law in this country. Can you stand in a public space and demonstrate? And up until last Monday, the answer was no. If you check on page 3 of my handout, if you have one, there was something called the 5-second rule, or AKA keep it moving. Demonstrators in Ferguson were not allowed to stand in a public space. And we're not talking about people who were necessarily blocking the access of traffic or anything else. Simply standing on the sidewalk. Are you allowed to do that? The answer was no. It was inconsistent in its application, but the answer was no. How about that for freedom of assembly? So we're getting down to the throbbing heartbeat of this subject when we look at this in terms of civil rights. And as I noted on page 3, just last Monday, a federal judge ruled that police in Ferguson would not be allowed to say, no, you can't stand there, keep it moving. Because what does keep it moving do? It makes people who can't keep it moving stand down. So the older people, or the people with any kind of a limp or whatever, might keep them from moving around the whole time that they'd like to demonstrate. That's an essential right, our right to disagree and to express ourselves peaceably. And in addition, civil rights demonstrations, when we study history, are almost never popular. They do arouse deep feelings among us, because it is disturbing to see a mass of people demanding change, particularly if we're not part of that original group. That is a disturbing kind of reality. And so I've quoted Dr. King on page 4 of the handout when he was asked in the mid-1960s on Meet the Press, aren't you doing more harm than good? Because polls have shown that people don't like this kind of activity. And his response was very eloquent. The demonstrations themselves don't change the reality. They won't change law. They are what they are. They're to call attention and to awaken conscience. Now, some of that will have a blowback effect. Some of those demonstrations will be more successful. And among the more successful ones, I think, was the one just last Saturday night at the St. Louis Symphony, where we saw not people saying no justice, no peace at Powell Symphony Hall. They sang a requiem for Mike Brown. In other words, they entered into this space to demonstrate, but they used the language of that space in order to make their point. And they sang beautifully. If you have not seen the video, watch the video. Because the news accounts, I've noticed, have taken kind of a split. Certain news accounts will call attention to interruption of the symphony. And it takes a while to get into the article to find out that they were singing a requiem for Mike Brown. Whereas some of the more positive media portrayals call attention to this as a requiem. It's a different kind of response. And then some people would unfurl banners from the balcony, flew out paper hearts. And if I can bring up the paper heart. Yeah, okay, it says Requiem for Mike Brown. I'm sorry that that's not bigger. But that's, yeah, I'm coming out to my time slide anyway. That's a form of demonstration to awaken conscience. And I think that's part of the discussion that we need to have, because alternative media are vitally important. One last example. When we talk about advocacy media, I'd like to give you what I think is one of the most amazing examples of this whole situation. The St. Louis American is a weekly black newspaper. Its managing editor is Chris King, a white man, by the way. Chris King was on the front line, but not physically. He was at his home with a variety of media in front of him, and because of the clout in the community that the publisher of the St. Louis American has, he also had access to power. And so there were a lot of outside agitators as part of that Ferguson demonstration in the first 10 days. And he had information being fed to him that he was filtering. And he had a webcam, which allowed him, as many of us, to watch what was actually happening at a particular place and time. This kind of thing was never shown on corporate media news. But Chris King, getting information, seeing somebody who's out, that he believed was outside the community, was able to text somebody in the police force, high-ranking, and to say, look at the guy with the white bullhorn and the red ball cap. He, we think, is dangerous. And that shifts the power relations, because really what we're talking about at the essence are power relations. And we're seeing through alternative media a kind of decentering of the traditional forms of power. And yes, we have to filter a lot when there's Twitter rumors and so forth, but between Twitter and other media, the webcams that allow us to see what's actually happening from peaceable protesters, many of whom came out during the day, as opposed to in the evening with the more rowdy protesters. In each case, what we find is a new kind of narrative. What you see depends upon where you stand. That's a Caribbean proverb that I've picked up. What you see depends upon where you stand. So media analysis and civil rights language and concepts and history, that's where I stand, and that's what I'm encouraging you to do as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions, so if... is this mic fine?
Left button, hold it closer to you.
Yes. Hello, that was loud. Yeah.
This is for anyone who wants to answer. What would have probably been the reaction if it was not a white man that shot him? Do you think it would have been different if an African-American cop had shot Michael Brown?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Would it have been any different if the police officer had been black, had been African American?
I would imagine it would be one of the many stories we just don't hear, because the officers shooting suspects occur every day. So I don't think we would have heard much of anything.
Can I add to that? On page 4 of my handout, it gets down to basic data. How many police killings are there in America? We don't know. It's not a statistic that our government keeps track of. Now, we know how many shark attacks there are, but we don't know how many police killings there are. So we need to know more data.
Along with the implicit attitude, I know how you said that it's like a white teacher treating a black person differently, but would you also say that it's like a black kid thinking about himself? Like, this is how people look at me, so this is how I'm going to act. And I feel like that, I know I've got a lot of friends. We had a club at my school for only African American boys, and it was to help raise their confidence and say that they could make something of themselves. And I feel like a lot of the race issues couldn't change unless the attitude of like a black man or a black woman looking at themselves changes. I know black people who say they're racist against black people, and it's just crazy to think about.
I hear what you're saying. When you deal with the African American identity, there is some conflict with trying to establish what being African American, being black actually means, and some of that does deal with the academic part of it. So I do agree slightly that if an African American says, as a part of my identity of being a male or man, I'm going to succeed, it'd be beneficial. The other part of that is that the teacher has to realize that because of his particular experiences or background, he's going to need specific things from her. If she goes into it, or he, the teacher, goes into it with the attitude that because he's a black male, he needs this, or he's going to act this particular way, then even if he says he wants to succeed, he's going to fulfill her particular expectations. There isn't anything that suggests that when you deal with African Americans that they actually have this belief that they don't want to succeed in academics. That generally isn't the case. They do want to succeed, and they do want to succeed. And I understand that they have to come up with something, but the response from the teacher still has to be aware that she can hold the attitude that he can only do so much, so she doesn't give that back to him.
I meant more or less the attitude of someone thinking of themselves. I know people who just think that I'm never going to move up in my life because of my status, and not even just education, it's anything, job, education, social status.
Well, that, just in general, for America in general, that's an issue in general. And so by definition, it's going to be a little bit more spotlight on the African American experience. Being able to overcome whatever obstacle you're dealing with, being able to work hard to get this particular thing. So that's, in America in general, that's an issue. So by definition, because African Americans are the minority, that's going to be a greater issue.
And an analogy would be women thinking they won't do well in math and science because they're women. And there are female students whose scores plummet once they hit high school in math and science because they just feel like they're not capable. And they've accepted that as part of their identity. Instead of fighting it and saying, I'm going to show you how good I can be at math and science, and overcoming all those obstacles.
We have lots of questions. We may run out of time. Most of us have business cards up there where you can contact us. If we don't get around to, we're going to try to get to as many people as we can.
I know this is a racial issue, but one thing that has really this issue has really hit home for me, police violence, and that's an issue that is particular. It's not just black people, it's Latino people and gay people and all these categories. And it just, does it seem, we were also talking about like collective action. Does it seem like giving police different ways to try to handle crises is becoming part of the conversation? Great, I haven't heard anything about that.
Can I speak to this for a second, guys? There's a lot of debate happening nationally about what that means to be a police officer, what it means to protect and serve, and there's a big dialogue that's happening nationally. Seattle Police is sort of one of the examples that people are looking at right now. They've totally altered the way that their police interact with people, and they're trying to take a more peaceful approach. I mean, globally, we've been looking at Great Britain. They don't carry guns. So they don't have any police death from guns because they don't carry them. And chaos hasn't ensued, so there is a lot of dialogue that's happening about it. And I would say one thing that I didn't get a chance to talk about in the history of St. Louis, a lot of the problems with our police forces in St. Louis come down to, again, that separation of city and county and the creation of municipalities. And these municipalities are all funded from tax dollars. So when you've got a lower tax base like you do in Ferguson, Darren Wilson was actually from Jennings originally, and he was fired with the entire police department to establish trust with their black community. So he came to Ferguson, and we have so many examples of police officers that have just been passed around for this racial discrimination, and they end up because they're cheaper, and so there is a discussion that is currently happening, but that's a hard, I mean, I don't know if I have the exact answer to that except to keep talking about it and get involved and get active and continue that conversation. Another thing, Ferguson Police Department had dash cameras. They just weren't installed. They were sitting in boxes in the basement. And just recently, there was a shooting that happened that was not related to one of the protests. The officer was wearing our brand new vest cameras. It wasn't turned on. And so it's like, it's frustrating, incredibly frustrating. But the only thing I can tell you is get active, find organizations, get your voice heard, keep pushing. And if there's enough people who push, we can see a cultural change.
I have a son who's been involved with the police more than he should. And y'all know what I'm talking about. And when I saw that mother, Michael Brown's mother, and they shot a boy and they left him on the ground for all that time. So I closed my eyes and I thought about my street, and if all these vehicles were there, and if I was sitting outside and they shot my boy, and for hours he just laid on the ground and I couldn't touch him. How can anybody not see that as inhumane? How can anybody not see that as wrong? I don't understand why people don't. 4 hours, the person you love most, right there, dead, and you can't touch them. Not while they're warm, not if they happen to have a breath. How can that possibly be misconstrued?
Can I speak to that? There's an Esquire magazine article titled "The Body on the Street," which deals exactly with that. And I've been haunted by that article, "The Body in the Street," because the body was left there, as you say, for 4 to 4.5 hours. And the article makes the point, that's what warlords do. That's what you see in dictatorships. It was intolerable psychologically to the people who were right there. And I think it accounts for some of the response.
And I can tell you from being in those Ferguson town hall meetings that are Ferguson only, that is one of the major points that keeps getting brought up. It's what people are saying. It's what people are talking about. It is.
It's unconscionable. I'm appalled, and I can't believe anyone, regardless of their skin color, wouldn't see that as wrong. Wrong.
First of all, thank you guys for creating this panel and doing all this for all of us here and presenting your opinions. I'm very serious about that on a personal level. I really appreciate it. So, my question to you guys is, how do you recommend someone? I'm a 24-year-old lesbian woman in the St. Charles community, and I feel like my outlets for participating in panels such as this, or I don't know, how do you suggest that I get more involved in gaining perspective on what's going on in Ferguson?
Heal St. Louis. Heal STL. It's all over Twitter. Look it up. There's actions. There's nonviolent demonstrations. There's a weekend of activities happening this weekend, just to name one thing.
And I believe Michael talked about Antonio French before. His Twitter feed, like I was just on there last night, and he has links to ways that you can get involved and get active. There's so many things that you can do. So they are available, and if you want to, like, email me or Michael, we can get you connected to some of those things.
Hi, just really quick. My heart hurts. I believe that society, if not pushed to learn and understand the events that happen in history, we're doomed to repeat it. And not understanding the amount of control that the police force has and the amount of control that we as a society together can have over changing things is just crazy. Like, I live right next to Ferguson, 5 miles to be completely honest, and I go down there quite often. I have to travel through it, and it's crazy. I go and I see all these buildings, and they have wood all up on their windows, and things are saying, yeah, we're still open, and you know. And the other day with a friend, another white girl, we went there and we wanted to pay our respects to the, you know, the thing on his road. I forget the word. And we were scared, not because of all the violence that was going on, but also because we are 2 white girls who feel like we are targeted as people who are racist. And I believe that it goes both ways. And like I said, when we experience history, and we are a part of it right now, you know, if we do not understand it and we don't push it in the future, it's going to be targeted towards everyone. It is not just towards, you know, black or Mexican, everything. There are people who feel like we are racist, you know, and I'm not racist.
Can I just speak to one of the things that this young lady said? Just to encourage you, I was with 3 white girls who walked down to that apartment complex, and I'm really ashamed to say that I've lived my whole life in Ferguson and did not realize how segregated we were until I started seeing all this. I found out that I live in a white neighborhood. I was not aware that there were white and black neighborhoods in Ferguson. There are. And I'd say that you have to be careful. You have to look and see what the climate is and what the environment is, unless you're totally one of those people that is prepared to get arrested. But it's perfectly safe to walk down to that memorial area and to pay your respects. So don't be afraid to do that. And one of the things that I have written down that I didn't say, one of the biggest points of conflict in Ferguson right now is that people, you talked about understanding, people are not listening and understanding the Black experience. There are two Fergusons being debated. There's the white Ferguson experience and the Black Ferguson experience. And until we can acknowledge that that Black experience is legitimate, that it is not imagined, that it is not made up, that it is wrong, we're not going to move past this. So I think that speaks to what you were saying.
Just a quick one. I do recognize that all white people aren't racist. I think typically with African Americans that's recognized. The situation that you're dealing with right there, to be honest, it is an immediate response because of what Grace mentioned, the experience that African Americans tend to have. It's a protective device that we tend to have because we're not aware who actually is for, with, or against us. We don't know. If I go on the stlouistoday.com and just read the post on any random story, and I have it right now so I know it's there. There was a shootout downtown, and the first comment was, I guess those were protesters. See, I don't know if that's your perspective or not, so my immediate wall is, I'm just gonna, hey, I gotta treat you like, really in essence how I feel like you're treating me. So I understand that, but it's still the acceptance of the implied idea. It's a response to how we tend to see things, we meaning someone African American.
And also racism isn't always on it's not an individual level anymore. Like I said, I was not aware that I was living in a segregated area, but that is, I mean, if you looked at, I mean, when I purchased my house, I looked for Black neighbors and I saw them and I thought I'm good. Then, like I looked at the map and I said, no, I'm in a white area. Part of being a responsible white person, right, is recognizing racism in your own actions when you're not aware of it and changing it. So a lot of that is implicit, recognizing it and acknowledging it and changing it.
Can you all stay a little bit longer or you have class? Okay, so I know it's putting time close to time, but we have more questions. So if anyone can stay, we can stay and discuss this. I know we have.
Would you say that the ice bucket challenge was on purpose and a distraction?
No, I think it was just a happy coincidence that both were occurring at the same time. I think the Ice Bucket Challenge was a different event, but it just happened at the same time. And they were very similar. It was interesting.
I just wanted to make a comment. First of all, I'm an American citizen of Indian origin, and as such a more recent immigrant than most of you. And I bring a perspective that makes me an Indian American and a psychologist. So we have zoomed into Ferguson and we heard our my esteemed colleagues and students here with their perspectives. And if you zoom in, there are a lot of solutions that give us a short-term strategy to solve this. But if you zoom out, historically these tensions existed. It'll continue to exist if you only focus on Ferguson. But if you look at it as a relationship issue and not harbor tensions, but focus on the relationship, there are two sides to any stories, or more sides than two. And if we hear each other out, there's a context to everything. And people behave in ways because of their context. And sometimes people come and tell me, oh, that didn't happen to me. And I always said, but it did happen to me. It could be because who I am and how I'm perceived. So perceptions, context, relationships are all important. And if you don't work on that, there won't be any long-term solutions. 1917, you read something from that period. And it seems like it's happening today. Why? Because we fix things. We don't try to find long-term solutions, which is harder. And if we think this is hard, let's start right now before we start trying to fix things around the world when we can't even fix racial relations here. And that's what I'm working on.
I wanted to respond to something Tobias said. My son is Pakistani, half American. He was raised in the Islam faith. And so he fell in love at 17 with this cute little white girl. And when he met her parents, that was the end of that relationship. And he was devastated. And so my son looks like a terrorist, and he gets questioned on airplanes all the time not to use the bathroom. Somebody might see him. So I hear you on that one. My other concern is when I talk to my students, my friends, my peers, my family, and we discuss the 53 police officers and 3 of them are African American, all of them say, you know what? Why don't those young black men and women become police officers, and then they can take care of their own city and yada, yada, yada. And my response is always, there is such a distrust in the police department in America. Why would any African American youth want to pursue that career? When they don't trust them, when they're treated badly, when they have most of them have not much positive things to say to the police department, why would they want to pursue that as a career? So I think that needs to change, so that our young people can say, yes, I want to protect and I want to serve.
Okay, so I'm a psych major, and I realized that I'm almost 19, and it's not about racism, or it's not about equality of marriage, and it's not about, oh my gosh, I'm Catholic, oh my gosh, I'm Islam, oh my gosh, I'm black, oh my gosh, I'm white. It's none of those stereotypes. It's because we grow up in a system. Our parents, our grandparents, they educated us. It's the whole nature versus nurture thing. And I myself am gay and very open-minded. I don't judge someone based on religion or based on what their skin color is. It's not about that. It's what they bring to the table. History repeats itself over and over and over again because it's what we're taught. We're taught about these things. So if we want to change history, it only takes one person, one voice, to change everything. Just like Martin Luther King did. He changed everything based on his belief, and he had people listen. So instead of sitting behind a computer or watching television, fight for what you want. Fight for what you stand for. Fight for what you want to happen. Not just say, oh yeah, I want racism to stop. Stand up and speak. Use your words. That's all that I have to say.
I just had a question. Do you think that PC and the standard that we're supposed to approach each other has anything to do with it? Because living here for 10 years, I noticed it's not so much full-out direct racism as it is racial paranoia of each other.
What was your question?
I just think that, do you think that PC has anything to do, like as how we treat each other, has anything to do? It seems more of a separatist view if, you know, I'm white and this is how I am and this is how you're supposed to talk to me, and this person's black and this is how you're supposed to talk to them.
Are you talking about being politically correct?
Yes, PC.
I'll actually talk about this. You know, I'm not sure there is, I blew through the data very quickly, first part of the spiel, but this data is real. The reality of the relationship between African Americans and police is real. They get pulled over more, they get stopped more, they get searched more. So, this is real. This is not an imaginary problem. And I love Marvin's, Professor Tobias' argument about implicit biases and implicit. I think it's a much nicer way of looking at it, because I don't think there's anything intending to be. I'm sure there are a few, but most police officers have no intention to do this. You have this implicit biases there, but it's not a political correctness thing. I really think it's an issue of, this is the reality of being black and a black man, especially in America.
May I interject? I think there are some PC types of assumptions in how media portray things. I watched Channel 2, 4, and 5 conventional corporate news in those first few days, and very rarely did they talk to somebody from Ferguson. They're not hard to find. Who did they talk to? They talked to the authorities. They talked to representatives from traditional organizations like the NAACP. They were too in touch, I think, with the traditional networks of power, which is why I try to emphasize alternative media. Who gets to tell the story? And with corporate media, it's the traditional voices of authority, not what's actually happening in the field. They didn't talk to too many people from Ferguson on one of the stations. They talked to one pregnant lady who'd been roughed up by police. Other than that, they just talked to authorities. I think that's PC.
I just have a quick comment. To the individual that, it is up to what they call the millennial generation is exposed to more technology. They tend to interact more with diversity. So a lot of the ideas and a lot of the biases that are portrayed out in the media that we tend to passively accept, I think that as we get more and each generation starts to be more involved and engaged, it will hopefully start to decline. When it comes to PC, I have a slight bias because when I do engage with debates with individuals, typically when they say PC, they're going to say things that aren't always factually correct. So I have no problem with people feeling like they're telling it like it is, as long as you're actually right in what you're actually telling like it is. So, just for example, recently in Ferguson, I got into a debate with someone because they said the problem with the black community, just keeping it real, the problem with the black community is that you have all these single moms and all these dads bail, you have all these moms have too many kids and you get your hand out. That's the problem, that's keeping it real. I'm not gonna be politically correct. I said, I appreciate you keeping it real, but the facts are actually slightly false. And that's fine. If you come at me and say, I'm gonna be politically correct, like, come real, come with your assumptions and beliefs, and we can talk, and I can tell you whether it's false, you might be able to educate me, but even that allows a dialogue. So I do understand, but when I see political, when I hear it, I'm like, oh, somebody's gonna tell something they just heard that they might have just read somewhere, that might not be true. So that's just, talk it like you feel it, say it like you mean it, and we can engage. I'm not going to get upset. That's just me.
And when I hear being politically correct, I think you're censoring yourself.
Thank you.
Rather than maybe coming to a better understanding and being civil with somebody, you're watching your P's and Q's so you don't say the wrong thing.
That's exactly what I mean, and that's what I see a lot, you know, and I mean, some of the things I hear from my friends is just craziness, and I mean, on both ends, you know, it's just a different environment, and I've been working in the labor department, you know, industry for the last 10 years, so, you know, hands-on, there's like, my first week was just breaking down the shield of some, you know, my now friends.
And I think that's what we're doing here today, is just asking you to seek information, genuinely, you know, just ask us questions. Ask each other questions.
Okay, so first I'd like to express my admiration for that initiative, because I think school and educational institutions in general are that place that is outside of the domain of the political propaganda and the media bias, where really truthful, open discussions on social issues can be held. And what fascinates me the most about the Ferguson case is, of course, it is extremely terrible, that segregation and racial notion that is attached to it. But what fascinates me the most is the easiness with which police officers pulled the trigger against civilians. And for a country that was founded upon the basis of liberty, for me that's really something that deserves to be addressed by the American community.
Yeah, I'm actually, one of the things that was so surprising, I heard police officers tell me that's how we're trained. We're trained, you know, and just shoot and empty your gun,
there's been
a training issue, yes.
And there's been a major shift, too, in how police officers have been trained since the war on drugs. And that's where a lot of this militarization of the police comes from, is from the war on drugs. It's literally a war that is now happening in the streets. streets, except it leads to a redefinition of what is the purpose of the police. If is it to view every citizen as a potential criminal, or is it to protect and serve? That definition, there is a big discussion, a big debate going on about that. No, I mean, I'm as a Ferguson resident, I'm grateful to have police in our area. I want the police to protect everyone equally, and I want them to realize that Black lives matter. But I don't want to get rid of the police. It's nice to have somebody who comes 911.
I actually just moved here from Kentucky maybe a couple weeks before the Saturday that the shooting happened. So I got to, I went to a high school. I know that Kentucky is classified as a hip state, and some of them are. But I went to a high school where it was predominantly white people. There was maybe a group of 10 African American people and maybe 1 or 2 people of another race. And I wanted to say that what that girl said about the whole nature-nurture effect, I think is very true. I mean, most of the people that I went to school with, it was the ideas that their parents filled into their head of these racist ideas, and the whole, you know, a lot of the African American guys that I went to school with of wanting to find a girlfriend in the school, and they couldn't because the girls' fathers were so against it. And I'm wondering if, you know, as these generations go by, can we begin to teach children to get these ideas out of their head and maybe solve these problems by trying to fill their heads with something besides racism? Because it's half the problem, I feel like, goes with parents teaching their kids that this is the right way to think.
You make a good point. Education is absolutely the key.
I am so thankful for the millennials. Millennials get a bad rap, and I technically am one of those, but I'm at the earliest stage of those. 1983, it starts in 1980, so it's not accurate to just dismiss the youth in America. This generation is being completely entitled. And in addition to teaching your children, it's absolutely necessary for you to get politically active, to vote. The 18 to 29-year-old population, I think recently they were polled and only 5% of them said they were planning on voting in this upcoming election in November. I don't even think half my students know there's an election coming up in November. This is where you can make a difference. You can vote for the legislators. You can demand that the legislators pursue the policies that you want. So it is on an individual basis, but get active.
I just want to stress one particular thing when people do the nature-nurture, because just because I'm psychology, typically what happens when babies are born, they're going to categorize within the first 2 years. They're going to classify and categorize based on what they see. We know that for a fact. Not going to change that. I think that I do agree that it's based on what the parents are teaching them, but it goes beyond that. Because if the parents are simply saying everyone's equal, everyone's amazing, everyone's great, it kind of diminishes the importance that some particular culture may have. So it's not so much everyone's equal, it's that particular person that you see, do you see that they're African American? Yes, I do. Then what you have to do is you have to instill in them, because of this particular idea that African American, the news is going to put out this thing that they're negative. It's not a situation when you want to force people to literally say because someone looks different, we're all the same and no one has a different past. It's recognizing that people might be different, and that doesn't mean that there's a deficit. Then that's personal opinion. That's what you want to stress, because I know they're going to classify, I know they're going to categorize, but you don't have to put something negative with that categorization. And that's what I think a problem.
You also have to understand that it's not just the parents who are teaching children, it's culture, society that has a profound influence. You can do, and I'm not a parent, but I know parents can attest to this, you can instill a value in your children all day, every day, talk to them about it, and if their friends aren't doing it, you know, it's a very challenging situation. So it's not just a simple black and white. We teach our children that this is wrong. They're learning from everything, media, everything that's being inundated and sent their way.
And I'm going to add a theory, a sociological perspective called contact hypothesis, which kind of rains on the parade a little bit, because it's saying what you're saying. It's saying, yes, we do want to reduce prejudice and discrimination, and here's a strategy. And one is to start with young people, but they have to be of equal status. So this goes to what Grace was talking about, what's going on in Ferguson. There's already economic inequality. So if I don't hate you because you're black, now I hate you because you're poor. You just happen to be poor and black. So until we have more equality in all areas, we're going to find another reason to continue to hold prejudiced attitudes. So the first thing is that we have to be of equal status to begin with, which is hard to do in our society because we are so stratified. Then we have to both agree that we want this. You and I both want prejudice and discrimination to go away. If I'm interacting with somebody who's okay with their prejudiced attitudes, I'm not going to change those. And then we have to work together and cooperatively to achieve those goals. So if we could do those three things, eliminate status inequality, share some goals, and get there together cooperatively, then we can do this. But there are so many additional obstacles in our way. Race is just one of them, that it becomes overwhelming and very difficult.
Well, I think we're winding down. I've got maybe one more question, and then
I'm going to have to go. I'm sorry to bail, but I have to go to office hours.
Okay, so if we're going to have one more question, then we'll all be around for comments too.
It's more of an interjection than a question. Earlier she spoke about, I think it was, I don't know your name, with the red hair.
Me?
Yeah, you spoke about control in Great Britain, about how police officers don't carry firearms. Firearms are just another tool, but it's just how you use it. A screwdriver's a tool. I can stab you with a screwdriver. You can fix a door. You can drive a car, or you can kill somebody. It's all in how you utilize it to win that action. It's just the utter disregard people have for human life. Just everybody's so quick to shoot each other or kill each other, rather than what happened to the playground and you just settle this way, or talk it out.
And you know, it is about training too. Like police officers are not trained to shoot to wound. They're trained to shoot to kill. But I will say it's a lot harder to shoot someone and kill them if you don't have a gun.
Okay, we got more. We're welcome to have a conversation, but I think if anyone needs to leave, I just want to thank you all again.